And as the music stops, a very warm welcome to Convocation 2022. It's a delight and privilege to see you all here. Thank you for making the journey. Thank you for being here today. A very warm welcome to those of you who are online. We're delighted you're joining us this afternoon for this historic convocation. It's my privilege to introduce the Reverend Dr. Malcolm Guite. He is a good friend of Virginia Theological Seminary, and for that connection, we are delighted. The actual title of this occasion is the Reinicker Lecture, a Virginia Quintet, a reading and reflection on 5 new poems to mark the VTS Bicentenary. The idea of this season is that as we do the work of understanding who we are and what we're aspiring to be, in a very real sense, we need the gifts of the poets, we need the gifts of the artists, we need the gifts of the playwrights. And today we're going to hear from one of the most distinguished Anglican poets working in the world today. Malcolm Guite is an Anglican priest, a poet, a singer-songwriter, and an academic. Born in Nigeria, he earned degrees from Cambridge and Durham universities, and his research interests include the intersection of religion and the arts, and the examination of works such as Tolkien, Lewis, Barfield, and British poets such as Samuel Taylor Coleridge. He's a Life Fellow at Girton College, Cambridge, and he has taught as visiting faculty at several colleges and universities in England and North America. He's the author of several books of poetry, as well as several books on Christian faith and theology. He also performs as a singer and a guitarist, fronting the Cambridgeshire bass blues, rhythm and blues, and rock band Mystery Train. You'll have to persuade him later, I think, to do such performances. That won't be part of today's Reinicker lecture. But nevertheless, he spent some time with us on the campus last spring, and we really have been eagerly looking forward to his return visit. So please, let's give a very warm Virginia Theological Seminary welcome to Malcolm Guite, and welcome him to the podium.
Well, thank you very much. It's a joy and an honor to be here. It's also quite daunting in this respect, in that your dean has entrusted me with trying in some sense to reflect on and to give you some of the poetic and imaginative languages with which to tell your own story. And who am I to do that? I feel I tread, I come as a stranger into the midst of your intimacies. But fortunately, I was able to come and be here and stay here and talk to students and faculty earlier on in the spring. And I was also able to see those extraordinary books that have come out of your history and look at those and to get a sense, the extraordinary stuff online about your work of reconciliation and reparation, the whole coming to terms with all of your story. And I found it deeply moving. So my journey that ends at this podium began rather to my surprise, well, in fact, entirely to my surprise. I had been giving a lecture on poetry at St. Martin's in the Fields and reading some poetry as well, the wonderful ancient church just on the edge of Trafalgar Square, which has a great engagement with, as it were, the common public culture, and they'd asked me to talk about poetry and theology. And afterwards, amidst the general hubbub and, as Eliot says, the clatter and the chatter, I found 2 very distinguished and dapper gentlemen coming forward to me, who proved to be none other than your dean and Barney Hawkins. And I couldn't entirely hear everything, but I heard the words Virginia Theological Seminary, Bicentenary, and poems for the liturgical year. And I assumed that they were simply saying that the 70 sonnets I'd written for the liturgical year that are in Sounding the Seasons, perhaps they could use them or read them, in some respect during the course of their centennial year. And I said, of course, by all means. And, and then I discovered what I'd signed up to, which was not, as it were, simply... Those poems, by the way, are always available to all. I have an agreement with my publisher, Canterbury Press, that any church or home group that wants to use those poems doesn't have to write tediously to the publisher. They can use them, they can put them in bulletins. They're on my blog. But I discovered what I'd let myself in for, which was actually turned out to be a really fascinating remit. I'm a poet who likes an external prompt, and boy, was this an external prompt. The idea was to write a sequence of 5 sonnets, which would indeed, as I had first heard, take us on that extraordinary journey through the liturgical year, that journey from Advent and through Christmas and Epiphany and into Lent and the great turning point of the cosmos, which is the death and resurrection of our Saviour that we celebrate in Good Friday and Easter, and then look beyond to Pentecost and beyond that to Trinity. That was indeed the remit, but it was a little more complicated than that. The idea was that I would take you through that journey, that I would take you through the journey of the turning year in its seasons, but that also in that I would offer some meditation, some reflection on the very essence and quiddity of your place, your vocation, your sense of incarnation, your sense of what it is to be a community, and particularly a community of reconciliation and reparation. And of course, I couldn't do that without coming and immersing myself in your community, and I'm extremely grateful to have had the opportunity to do that. No, that's all right. Here's one I prepared earlier. Yes, I could have been panicking here. No, so yeah. So I came and I observed, and last spring I began to write the sonnets, and then I went away and meditated, and I was able to complete them, unusually for me, I mean, I obviously, because they're yours, these are not mine, these are yours, you've commissioned them. So I held them close to my chest. I didn't share them anywhere or with anyone. In fact, the only 2 people who know what you're about to hear in any way is my wife and your dean, and not even in that order. I checked it with the dean before I ran it past the wife. So what I'd like to do, if I may, is just begin by sounding these poems out for you and reading them. I don't think a poem lives on the flat page. I think it has to be breathed into being and sort of shimmer into the air between the speaker and the listener. Now, you may think, oh my goodness, this is a bit daunting. 5 sonnets, when do I duck? Don't worry, when Dante Gabriel Rossetti wrote the famous sonnet beginning, "A sonnet is a moment's monument," he was not only talking about the way the poem might be a monument to a given moment in passion or love, he also meant it literally takes 1 minute to read a sonnet. So, this is even going to be less than the usual Anglican 10-minute soundbite sermon as far as the sonnets are concerned. But what I also hope to do is open them up. So I'm going to read them to you as is. And I should say, don't... I think last time I came and spoke to you and spoke about poetry, I felt I almost needed to perform a minor exorcism. Some people, duck when they hear the word poetry. They've had bad experiences of it. They're possibly haunted by the unrested shade of a bad English teacher who did poetry. The kind of English teacher whose idea, if I can quote the Texan poet Billy Collins, who was writing about his experiences of bad English teaching, he said about his teacher, her idea of doing poetry was to tie the poem to a chair and beat it with a hosepipe till it confessed what it meant. He says, by contrast, that he wanted to put his ear up to the murmuring hive of the poem and wonder what honey the innumerable bees of its words were making, or words to that effect. That's what I'd like you to do. So don't think, oh golly, I've got to get it all at once. You're going to be given the poems shortly. You're going to see them. You're going to be able to take them home and reflect on them. You'll be able to see the words, but I don't want to give you the words to see first because I'd like you to hear it. And I had the great honor and pleasure back in 2002 of interviewing Seamus Heaney, the late Nobel laureate, because he won the Wilfred Owen Memorial Prize. And in the course of, and I was there when he took the award. So in the course of our conversation, we talked about how poetry is received and understood. And he said that perhaps the days are gone when people retain an entire poem or can recite it. It's not taught that way in school. But they may retain fragments or phrases. And then he said he hoped that what his poetry would offer, however it was finally received years after his death, that his poetry would offer, and I'm quoting him directly here, phrases that feed the soul. So I hope that somewhere, scattered amongst my sonnets, will be some phrases that feed your soul, and some phrases that express something of the soul of this extraordinary place. So let the poem, as it were, just sound above you, wash over you, work through you. If a particular phrase helps, stay with that one. There'll be a chance to catch up with the others. You'll have as much time with these poems as you like. I always say to my students when they say, oh, I don't get it, I don't get it. And I say, well, of course you don't get it first time round. You know, you don't want to go out with a poem that gives you everything on the first date. You know, you want to... You want a poem where you have a lifetime relationship and it's going to sneak up on you 20 years later and give you an unexpected kiss of meaning. So I'm going to read the poems now without further ado, and then you'll get copies and we just have a chance to open up a few things. But I will lastly say one phrase, the opening phrase, in fact the opening line of the whole sequence, sets one of the deepest themes that I've tried to open out. And that opening line is, only together, never set apart. And it's your story as the part of the story of integration, but it's also Christ's calling us as one body, the way we need each other, the way we need to hear each other's pains and story, include one another, especially those who have been excluded, in the story of who we are, because we are joined together in Christ. So only together and never set apart is perhaps a key phrase. So here we go. A Virginia Quintet for the Bicentenary of the Virginia Theological Seminary. Only together, never set apart, can we begin that pilgrimage whereby the turning seasons turn us till we make the long repentance of the restless heart, the journey into one another's pain, which is Christ's journey into us. We take the bread, we bless, we break, and once again he'll take and bless and break us, and will send us out into the world he loves to be his body and his blood, his mystery, his new beginning and his fruitful end, his touch, his taste, his breath, his word, his song, his call to rise, his kingdom's flag unfurled, his advent and adventure in the world. So that's the first one, Advent. Now, Christmas Epiphany. His advent and adventure in the world begins with Mary's yes. Her fruitfulness, the font and inspiration of our own. We join with her and offer our own yes, that in us too Christ's life might be unfurled. He who was born in Bethlehem comes to be born in Alexandria, born to the Black Madonna and the White, born as a slave who makes his captors free, born deep within us on the darkest night, whilst snow falls softly on the holy hill, as delicate as silver filigree, that all the wounds of our long history might yet be searched and healed by his true light. And Lent, Easter. That we might come at last to his true light, we turn again to him when all things turn. The year returns to growth and spring. Our sight is blessed with tender green. We learn to hold the gospel plough, to follow him and not look back. Our Lenten discipline, opens deep furrows in the frozen soul and shears through the obstruction of our sin, harrows our hearts and opens us to him till Christ the sower finds in us good soil. Seeds of his kingdom, deep in our dark clay, will stir with hidden growth through Holy Lent. We'll share with him Good Friday's dark descent and rise to life with him on Easter Day. Pentecost. We rise to life with him on Easter Day, and he begins in us a new creation. Our old divisions are all blown away by heaven's breath in love and liberation. Now, there is neither Jew nor Greek, nor slave nor free, nor male nor female, only one identity, entirely found in love and utterly affirmed in him alone. Now, tongues of fire, love-laden, heaven-sent, are kindled in our neighbors' lives and ours. The ones we used to scorn are radiant with heaven's light. All we once had is theirs, and theirs is ours. We gather in one place and see God in each other, face to face. Trinity and beyond. We gather in one place, this holy hill, girded and circled in the Trinity. 3 windows for one single light to fill and spill. Refracted light from Canterbury patterns the sun, who is both sown and sower, the firstborn of creation. For the Father, a round of oak leaves like the oaks of Mamre, where angels came to Abram, and we gather into encircled hospitality to share the bread of angels. One last light, cerulean blue for heaven's mystery, brings us the Spirit as a dove in flight. And these 3 lights are one, below, above, and in, and through, and with us all. One love. So there are your poems. Now, thank you very much. So we could just say, okay, I've done it now, I've delivered them, but we have a little time. So I thought perhaps we might like to open them up, and I will perhaps talk to you a little bit as we look at them individually about some of the things that I wanted to put in or draw out, though I hasten to add that anything I say is never going to be definitive. You may remember the wonderful bit in the trial of Socrates, Plato's Apology, where you remember Socrates says he's gone around looking for wisdom everywhere in Athens because he can't understand how the oracle said he was the wisest man. You remember, of course, he concludes it because there's the only one who knows he's ignorant. But there's a wonderful passage in that where Plato tells us that Socrates went to the poets because he saw and felt and heard great wisdom in the poetry they uttered, and found that when he talked to the poets themselves, they talked complete nonsense, and he knew more about what was in their poems than they did. And he concludes that there was some kind of, some sort of diamond, some inspirational spirit that came into them, and the poets weren't really any wiser than anyone else about what was really going on. So I can offer you a few things, but there may be more. I hope there is more, and I hope there's more that you yourselves will find. So does everyone have, more or less have a copy of them now? That's great. And I believe they've been sort of posted out and are winging their way over the interwebs to those who are listening online. And it's lovely. I can't see you, but I know you're there, those of you who are following online. So, the 5 sonnets, the quintet, taking us from Advent through Christmas and Epiphany, and Lent and Easter, Pentecost. And I was a bit hesitant when I used that final title, Trinity and Beyond. It reminded me, I know not how, of some Pixar movie about infinity and beyond. But I hope that's not too much of a distraction or an echo. But I did want to say beyond because I wanted to, as you'll have discerned, one of the things I was trying to do was to think about the specific vocation of this institution, which is to form a new generation of priests year after year for the church and send them out in service. And so the beyond in that final title is very much about what happens after this place. So it's particularly nice to be speaking to a group of people who have left and have returned and know more perhaps than they'd care to tell about what happens in that beyond. But I hope, in fact, the fact that you've returned would suggest this is the case, that something that was given to you here in love, in community, in friendship, in sacrament, in priestly formation has equipped you. And perhaps you've deepened the reach into this place precisely as you began to find the practical consequences of what may have seemed on some dull Friday afternoons purely theoretical. So we begin with the Advent poem. Only together, never set apart, I've already mentioned, is the key phrase. I felt I'd begun to get something of one of the deeper themes here in those phrases. We make the long repentance of the restless heart, the journey into one another's pain, which is Christ's journey into us. The restless heart is, of course, an allusion to St. Augustine's beautiful saying, "You have made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless till they find their rest in thee." I have to say, if you're going to steal, steal from the best. And I stole from Augustine in the following lines as well. There is a sermon that Augustine gave in his role as Bishop of Hippo to his priests when he was giving them their ordination charge, in which he said, "You are to be taken, blessed and broken, that the work of the kingdom may go forward." And he wasn't kidding, because, the Goths were at the gate, as it were, and, the Hippo itself was in a perilous position in the kind of slightly anarchic conditions of his time. And we too live in more than slightly anarchic conditions. And there is certainly blessing, but there also has been and will be breaking and sharing. I was talking to one of the folk from Florida here, just churches themselves as well as people's homes utterly devastated, a huge new work to begin rebuilding. So it's not necessarily metaphorical language. But the journey into one another's pain, that is to do with really hearing the other. It's to do with understanding your own story from another person's perspective. And I was very moved by the book that Dean Markham gave me, which was written by African-American members of your community, telling the whole story from their perspective, looking back to St. Cyprian's and those extraordinary first moves, which you pioneered. I mean, I was amazed to see how early integration was happening here, before even the full swing of the civil rights movement, but painful. Because those who had been privileged and in this place had to learn, not just in theory, but in practice, to know how things looked and felt from somebody else's perspective. And that job is never finished. We constantly retreat into ourselves and bolster ourselves with sort of specious private narratives in which we are heroic, without accepting that we are not always heroic. Now, as Christians, we're all right here. We can do this because each of us has heard the enormous yes. Christ is the yes in all God's promises. And we don't therefore need lots of ticks and likes and we don't need to impress anybody God has already said yes to us in Jesus Christ. And therefore we can be frank about failures, frank about sin, frank about the times when our narrative has been specious, inadequate, and self-serving. And we can let it go and hear another version of the story. Now here I must thank you, because I was fascinated by the work that you've done, the serious historical work, to trace the descendants in your own neighborhood and community of those persons in enslaved labor who built some of your buildings. Not just to say that was then, this is now, it's an episode. Not just to do a token thing and fling some money at something in a kind of brief piece of virtue signaling, but actually to find out who was deprived, who are their descendants, and that you found some of those people and you've welcomed them in, and this has been a place where they could come. And I was looking at the work that was being done there, and the sense of there are a series of unnamed persons to whom we owe an enormous amount, from whose labor we have benefited, who must, even posthumously, be honored, and whose descendants must be honored. And I feel you've been doing that. Now, as it happened, entirely independently of this, I was asked by my own college, Girton in Cambridge, to be part of their Legacies of Enslavement working group. And this was a new thing for us, and there were various members of our extended college community and alumni who were saying, well, it's nothing to do with us, you know. We were founded in 1869 after the abolition of slavery, no problem. No. We came to discover that a really significant early donation to our college, which was made by an extraordinary woman who was never part of the college, but wanted to sustain its radical pioneering effort to educate women, to give women higher education. We were the first college of higher education in England, the first in Cambridge. We sustained and nurtured academic women from 1869 through to it was only in 1947, I'm sorry to say, that Cambridge admitted women to degrees. 1947. We kept the door open all those years. So we always thought we were on the side of the angels. It turned out that one of our largest donations was from somebody who had inherited her wealth from a Virginia plantation. And so we began to investigate. And because I saw what you were doing, I was able to encourage the historical researchers whom we were employing to find out. We now have the archives of that plantation. We're beginning to find the names of some of the persons. We're looking at creating bursaries and scholarships named for those people. And we're recognizing that we benefited from unpaid labor, which purchased the leisure, whereby we did good things, but it was at someone else's expense. And the very least we can do is empathetically imagine what that life was like and know something about it. That's a little bit of what I meant by the journey into one another's pain. But I added this, which is Christ's journey into us. Whatsoever you do for the least of these, you do for me. But also, howsoever you neglected the least of these, or exploited the least of these, you exploited or neglected me. And if that's true, then in telling the untold story, I'm finding Christ again. I'm finding the Christ in those people from whom I averted my eyes. And unless I stop averting my eyes, there'll be something of Christ, of all that Christ has for me, that I will have missed. And as I say, my effort to know and understand your story more deeply fed directly, I think, into a fuller and deeper response from my own college in the work that we were doing. So I'm grateful to you for that. The rest of that sonnet, as I say, I stole from Augustine. We take the bread, we bless, we break, and once again he'll take and bless and break us, and will send us out into the world. And after touching on that pain, I wanted a lift at the end of that sonnet. I wanted to give you a little sense of the sheer power and glory of what you're doing. What an extraordinary thing it is to be ordained. What an extraordinary thing it is to be sent out into the world, to be his body and his blood, his mystery, his new beginning and his fruitful end. You are in various places when you reach out to and touch the person that you're caring for, the elderly, frail person. You are his touch, his taste, his breath, his word, his song, his call to rise his kingdom's flag unfurled. And I wanted in this opening poem to have some sense that what you do, first in coming here and then in leaving here, is to begin a great adventure. And it is, the word advent, of course, is in the word adventure. The adventure is what comes to you. In Thomas Mallory, the knights who are about to go off, they don't plan the itinerary at all. There's no agenda. The great phrase in Mallory is, let us take the adventure that God sends. And as G.K. Chesterton said, an inconvenience is only an adventure wrongly considered. So I hope you have not lost your sense of adventure. So then we move from that to Christmas, from Advent into Christmas and Epiphany. His Advent and adventure in the world begins with Mary's, yes. I was very moved to be shown around when I first got here by your dean, and to see the Madonna, the Black Madonna that you've got there, that extraordinary sculpture near the ruins of your old chapel, really powerful, Magnificat. And now, of course, you've got that lovely thing in the Scott reception room there, with the beautiful Orthodox theology of Mary as the burning bush. That's hugely powerful. But of course, the early church writers told us, Mary is the type, the archetype of every Christian. She is the type of the whole church, and she's the type of every one of you. That you will be open to God's prompting, that you too will say, be it unto me according to his word, that you too, as it were, will grow big with God, that you will bear fruit, that from the particular material circumstances, the very visceral circumstances of your bodily life, committed to Christ wherever you're sent, you will be bringing Christ to people into the world as surely as she did. And so I say, with our own yes, that in us too Christ's life might be unfurled. He who was born in Bethlehem comes to be born in Alexandria. I was thrilled to discover that this is Alexandria. That's wonderful. Though I think I'd be very careful of your library if I were you. There's not a good track record of libraries in Alexandria, but I take it you've learned from what happened to the chapel, so the library is going to be fine. So born to the Black Madonna and the White, born as a slave who makes his captors free. I was, of course, because it's not my story, and I touch on tender and deep wounds in the whole of your nation, almost reluctant to use the word slave. But it is such a crucial word in the New Testament. Doulos, it does not, the Christian doesn't shy away from that. And, Christ's obedience to death. So, born as a slave who makes his captors free. That's true of Christ in his complete obedience unto death, his utter service to us. I have come among you as one who serves. That is true. But I think if Christ is in those Christians that were worshipping at St. Cyprian's when worship had to be separate, if Christ was in those believing slaves back in the day, then something in their love, something in their worship, something in their is part of how Christ comes to save you. And you thank him in and through them by honoring them and remembering them and taking care of their descendants. Born as a slave who makes his captors free, born deep within us on the darkest night. I was concerned that since I was supposed to be going through the seasons, not only the liturgical seasons, but the actual seasons, that in an ideal world, I'd have come 4 or 5 times a year and, done a little meteorological research about what was possible. But luckily, I had an agent in the place in the form of Andrew Lazo, so I got him to send me lots of photographs that he'd taken over all the seasons. So I just wanted to double check that there was snow. And so, because I wanted also to have a sense of the beauty of this place and the beauty of the changing seasons. So I permitted myself a little sort of romantic delicacy when I said, whilst snow falls softly on the holy hill as delicate as silver filigree, but then returned that all the wounds of our long history, and I say our, not your, I've discovered in my work for my college and in my deeper readings of the whole of our shadowed imperial history, that these are our wounds too. I own and own up to the exploitations that put Britain where she was in empire. As much, I was born in a colony. Nigeria was still a colony when I was born there in 57. It was just coming towards independence, and my father was very much part of wanting to enable and equip that country for its independence. But nevertheless, that was the state when I was there. So I say our, that all the wounds of our long history might yet be searched and healed by his true light. I find that notion of searching a wound to remove the bullet, as it were, or draw the sting, or cleanse it, incredibly helpful. Because what you've been doing in your attempt to tell your story more fully than it might have been told in the 30s or 40s, to tell it the way you tell it now, a century later, is to do with searching, asking searching questions, asking awkward or uncomfortable questions, but only in the searching of the wound can the healing happen. You will see that in some sense, the wounds searched and healed. I suppose I couldn't help feeling I was echoing Eliot's, "The wounded surgeon plies the steel that questions the distempered part. Beneath the bleeding hands we feel the sharp compassion of the healer's art." It is compassion, but it is sharp. And I've been impressed, again, looking at your documents, at your history, at the way you're telling your story, by the sharpness of the questions that you've dared to ask. I thoroughly commend you for that, and it seems to me it's going to be all the better for you as an institution that you can tell and retell and frame and reframe your story so honestly. Might yet be searched and healed by his true light. I think I was echoing, I must acknowledge all my debts in this. I was echoing, do you have a hymn which has the lines, "His light will judge and judging heal"? Do you have that hymn? It's a line in one of our hymns. And I've always loved that it's in the judgment that the healing comes. It's in what's revealed that the beginning of healing becomes possible. So, might yet be searched and healed by his true light. So that took us to Christmas and Epiphany, and now Lent and Easter. That we might come at last to his true light, we turn again to him when all things turn. The year returns to growth and spring. Our sight is blessed with tender green. And here again, I will acknowledge a debt. I am myself deeply moved and formed by the sermons and teaching of Lancelot Andrewes, the great bishop, the great translator of the many parts of, certainly a lot of the Old Testament parts in the authorized version. He was Dean of Westminster when the king called the Hampton Court Conference in 1604, and he supervised and saw through that project until the authorized version came out in 1611. And he was one of the greatest preachers of his age. So gifted in languages. When he died, Bishop Buckeridge preaching at his funeral that said that Lancelot Andrewes knew so many languages that he could have served as Interpreter General at the Confusion of Tongues. I mean, it was extraordinary. But I was very moved by one of his Lenten sermons. We have a whole series of his Ash Wednesday sermons in which he reaches out to the turning of the season and turns on the very idea of turning. So the year returns to growth and spring. The time has come when all things turn. He was preaching in 1619, after the translation had come out, Andrewes was preaching on Joel. Therefore now saith the Lord, turn unto me with all your heart. And he has this prolonged notion of turning and returning, which deeply moved T.S. Eliot. And there's quite a bit of Ash Wednesday, which is lifted lightly from that sermon, just as the entire opening of the Journey of the Magi is lifted pretty much straight from one of the Nativity sermons. You know, well, Eliot himself said, mediocre poets borrow, good poets steal. And when asked what the distinction was, he says, well, if you borrow something, you don't do anything with it, you don't change it or make anything new of it, because you're going to have to give it back intact. But if you steal it, you can make it your own and bend it into whatever form you like. Let me read you, just by way of return, since I borrowed or stole from Andrews, something of that sermon. You'll see it there. It's so beautiful. It hath seemed, this is Andrews in 1619, really defending the whole liturgical year as well. It says, it hath seemed good to the Holy Ghost and to the church to order there shall be a solemn set return once in the year at least. I suppose this is in its own way for you a solemn set return, a redire ad principe. But, and reason, for once a year all things turn, and that once is now at this time. For now at this time is the turning of the year. In the heaven the sun in his equinoctial line, the zodiac and all the constellations in it do now turn about to the first point. The earth and all her plants after a dead winter return to the first and best season of the year. The creatures, the fowls of the air, the swallow and the turtle, the crane and the stork know their seasons and make their just return at this time every year. Everything now turning, that we should also make it our time to turn to God in. Boy, they don't preach them like that anymore. It's just, it's so magnificent. So we turn again to him when all things turn. The year returns to growth and spring. And I took the idea of the harrowing with the plough. Seems strange just as spring is coming to start abstaining from things and having Lenten discipline. I mention Christ the Sower, not least because I'm going to return to that in the final sonnet, that window, based on the Canterbury Christ the Sower window. But also because it's an extraordinary thing that the parable of the sower is called the parable of the sower, because the parable pays far more attention to the soil than to the sower. I was once on a discussion panel with the great contemporary Irish poet Michael O'Sheil, and he was asked whether, seeing he was a Christian in that rather dry and highly secularized world of high-end cultural poetry, whether he as a Christian thought he might be sowing the seeds of the gospel with his poetry. And he almost jumped back. He said, goodness, he said, I assume you're alluding to the parable of the sower, he said. My understanding of that parable is that both the sower and the seed are the word himself. I don't make that presumption, but I'm very interested in the attention the parable pays to the soil. And he says, I hope what my poetry will do. Why is the good ground good ground? Where is it? And he talked about his garden in Connemara being full of stones and how he would take the soil and put it in a griddle and shake it about so he could get the stones loose. And he said, what I hope my poetry will do is jostle the soil of the imagination so that when the sower, whosoever comes and the word comes, it will find good ground and take root. And I would say that that's exactly what I would want to do with poetry or any of the arts, not to presume that sacred thing which in sense only Christ himself is in charge of, the sowing of and the being of the word, but at least to make sure that the soil of our imagination is shaken up a bit and open and ready to receive. But I put it more sharply than that here. I thought about the harrow of the plough that makes plough down silly and shine, as Hopkins would say. Shears, opens deep furrows in the frozen soul, shears through the obstruction of our sin, harrows our hearts, and opens us to him till Christ the sower finds in us good soil. And then I turn, of course, to Christ's own saying about the meaning of his own death and ours. Unless a grain of wheat falls into the ground and dies, it bears no fruit, but if it dies, it yields a rich harvest. And all of Lent, all the little givings up, are a preparation for that letting go, surely. That letting go of ourselves completely into God, which we can do in various ways now, but which we will ultimately do. And he will sow us deep in the heart of who he is, that we may rise with him, Christ the first fruits, and then all of us, we share with him Good Friday's dark descent and rise to life with him on Easter Day. And so then I turned to Pentecost. And what's, again, to borrow from Andrews, there was Andrews. I was asked once when a book was coming out about the 400th anniversary of the King James Version, and it was known that I'd done some work on Andrews, who was so involved in that translation. They said, "Is there a theology of translation available through Andrews?" So I sat down and read. It was a fascinating experience. We have Exton. We have every single sermon on Pentecost that he preached from 1604, when he got the gig, as it were, and the king said, "You organise these people and get a decent new translation out of them," to 1611, when the project was completed and the book came out. And it was absolutely fascinating to read those sermons. But let me just give you a key thing that he says. It was a patristic commonplace, which everybody knew and quoted in their sermons, to link the story of the confusion of tongues at Babel with the miracle of being understood again and communication at Pentecost. But the standard way of putting that until Andrews was to say that the curse of Babel was reversed in the blessing of Pentecost. So Andrews opens this up and then says, well, that's not quite so. And he says this: if God in Pentecost had simply undone or reversed the confusion of tongues, the creation of the myriad languages, what would have happened at Pentecost would have been that all these people from Mesopotamia and the parts of Arabia belonging to Phrygia and all that long list of places that people stumble over when they get that reading, what would have happened if it was simply reversed would have been that they would have all suddenly understood classical Hebrew. And their own mother tongues and every beautiful, strange, quirky distinction of their languages would have been eradicated. And we would have been right back to what was the problem with Babel, which was a huge, towering, monstrous, monocultural, monoglot idea of human power, with one dominant culture and everybody else excluded or forced to learn the other language. That is not what happened at Pentecost. What happened at Pentecost was that God gladly risked translation. He was willing to be translated into all these tongues. And why, says Andrews, why did God take that risk? Why did he say that I will bless every language and everybody's mother tongue will be glorious with the gospel? Why did he do that? Because, says Andrews, there are not tongues enough to praise God. And then he asked this question: why would God risk being lost in translation? Is he not afraid of translation? Is he not afraid that some pristine thing in the first culture and language that you received things in is going to be watered down if things are put in other terms? No, says Andrews, because God himself has already undertaken the greatest translation of all, and that is when the word was translated into flesh, when the whole of heaven was expressed in the particular, the physical, the bodily, and, to borrow Shakespeare's phrase, given a local habitation and a name. And Andrew's entire theology of translation is to have variety, to have the indigenous, to have the particular, to have the local. And even within his own sermons, he never quotes the scripture in only one language. He'll give you a bit of Latin, he'll give you Greek, he'll give you Hebrew, and then he'll often translate it into English in fairly different ways, using the different registers of English, the Latinate or the French or the Saxon, the many languages that make the one language, which is English. I think that's something that he learnt from his contemporary and possibly someone he knew, since they were both hanging around James's court at exactly the same time. And that, of course, was William Shakespeare. Shakespeare delights in the variety of languages within English. You remember with the washing hands scene, would all great Neptune's oceans watch these hands? No, rather would these my hands the multitudinous seas incarnadine, making the green one red. Do you hear the movement from the big Latinate, multitudinous incarnadine, a word he just made up, and then green one red. You'll see that again and again in the Authorized Version, a move between registers to include them all. So, there is a unity at Pentecost, but it is not a unity which is at the expense of diversity and particularity and the tang, as it were, the local tang. So our old divisions, the false divisions, are blown away. Yes, some things are dissolved, neither Jew nor Greek nor slave nor free, but a new identity affirmed in him. But tongues, plural, tongues of fire, love-laden, heaven-sent, are kindled in our neighbours' lives and ours. And again, I was turning to your particular history and the things you've learnt from it. When I wrote the line, the ones we used to scorn are radiant with heaven's light. We see the light we missed when we turn to the neighbour we've neglected or excluded. And that may be the very light we most need to see. All we once had is theirs, and theirs is ours. We gather in one place and see God and each other face to face. And then just to make some final remarks on the last sonnet, which is set in your beautiful chapel, your new chapel. Again, Dean Markham gave me a tour and showed me all the windows and the way they related to the persons of the Trinity. And I think you showed me the photograph of the Christ the Sower window in Canterbury. And then the setter of your window had seen the pattern that the light on the stone made, and then made that the pattern. So it's quite mysterious. You have to kind of look and see the shapes. But once you see it, it's like something you haven't quite had in focus, coming into focus. So in a sense, all I did in this sonnet was really to set in musical language something of the experience of sitting in your chapel and knowing what all those things meant. And then to finish with the Trinity, these three lights are one, below, above, and in and through and with us all, one love. And I hoped that the last words of this sequence, one love, would mesh with, and in a sense, bring to a conclusion the opening words. What the story has been, I hope, is from saying only together, never set apart, and then looking at the ways those apartnesses have happened, the way those divisions have both happened and been healed, and bringing them together with the words one love. Now we're going to have a chance to shortly to perhaps open this up to discussion. The Dean and I will sit there and we can have questions. Perhaps he can begin with them. But if you'll pardon me again, I think, as I say, poems don't necessarily give everything on the first date. And having opened out a few things, I'd like, as it were, to pack them back in and read the poems to you again. But this time you have sight of them. And then that will be me done here, and we'll have our chance to open it up more widely. You can tell me all the things I missed. But, you know, the lesson of the sonnet is less is more. I've only got 14 lines, you know. So, okay, here we go. A Virginia Quintet. Advent. Only together, never set apart, can we begin that pilgrimage, whereby the turning seasons turn us, till we make the long repentance of the restless heart, the journey into one another's pain, which is Christ's journey into us. We take the bread, we bless, we break, and once again he'll take and bless and break us, and will send us out into the world he loves, to be his body and his blood, his mystery, his new beginning and his fruitful end, his touch, his taste, his breath, his word, his song, his call to rise, his kingdom's flag unfurled, his advent and adventure in the world. Christmas Epiphany. His advent and adventure in the world begins with Mary's yes. Her fruitfulness, the font and inspiration of our own. We join with her and offer our own yes, that in us too Christ's life might be unfurled. He who was born for us in Bethlehem comes to be born in Alexandria, born to the Black Madonna and the White, born as a slave who makes his captors free, born deep within us on the darkest night, whilst snow falls softly on the holy hill, as delicate as silver filigree, that all the wounds of our long history might yet be searched and healed by his true light. Lent, Easter. That we might come at last to his true light, we turn again to him when all things turn. The year returns to growth and spring. Our sight is blessed with tender green. We learn to hold the gospel plough, to follow him and not look back. Our Lenten discipline opens deep furrows in the frozen soul and shears through the obstruction of our sin, harrows our hearts and opens us to him, till Christ the sower finds in us good soil. Seeds of his kingdom, deep in our dark clay, will stir with hidden growth through Holy Lent. We'll share with him Good Friday's dark descent and rise to life with him on Easter Day. Pentecost. We rise to life with him on Easter Day, and he begins in us a new creation. Our old divisions are all blown away by heaven's breath in love and liberation. Now there is neither Jew nor Greek, nor slave nor free, nor male nor female, only one identity entirely found in love and utterly affirmed in him alone. Now tongues of fire, love-laden, heaven-sent, are kindled in our neighbours' lives and ours. The ones we used to scorn are radiant with heaven's light. All we once had is theirs, and theirs is ours. We gather in one place and see God in each other, face to face. Trinity and beyond. We gather in one place, this holy hill, girded and circled in the Trinity. 3 windows for one single light to fill and spill. Refracted light from Canterbury patterns the sun, who is both sown and sower, the firstborn of creation. For the Father, a round of oak leaves like the oaks of Mamre, where angels came to Abram, and we gather into encircled hospitality to share the bread of angels. One last light, cerulean blue for heaven's mystery, brings us the Spirit as a dove in flight. And these 3 lights are one, below, above, and in and through us all. One love. Thank you.
I'll make sure that I can see Kathy. And anybody who's watching online, feel free to include a question, and that will be passed on to me by Kathy Stout. So let me just start by saying the reason why I think the poet at a moment like this is so important is because America is basically polarized when it comes to telling the story of the past. So you have one narrative that says, the founding fathers, they wrote this remarkable document, the Constitution, they resisted the temptations for monarchy. This Constitution has birthed a country that is the strongest, the richest, the most powerful in the world. That's partly God's providence. Sure, there was slavery and segregation, but that was confronted in the 1960s, and slowly we're getting better. And then you have the other narrative that says, no, the truth is that slavery and segregation aren't footnotes to the story. It's an intrinsic part of the story. And the truth is that from 1619, the very wealth of America was parasitic on the labor of the exploited. And racism never really goes away. It just mutates from slavery into segregation, Jim Crow, mass incarceration, and so the list goes on. And what I find the power of your poetry is you manage to pick up the themes of repentance, and you dig deep into the depths of what repentance entails and the obligation it requires and the wound that needs to be explored. And you combine it with a hopefulness that the future can be different and it doesn't have to be the same. Is that a fair read of what you're trying to do?
That's certainly something of what I am trying to do. I think I might just pick up on the word wound. I think the word wound, I've described these as wounds, the wounds of our long history, searching the wounds. Now, another kind of writing would have said faults or sins or, ideological aberrations and all those things. Why do I choose the word wound? I think because when we fall into sin, when we do oppress a neighbor, we're wounding ourselves, There's a wonderful passage in St. John Chrysostom's catechetical lectures on the Ten Commandments, which I'm sure you read every evening. But weirdly enough, I found myself reading them in a slightly obsessive moment in my theology, and they're actually brilliant. But when he's discussing the commandment, "Thou shalt not kill," I mean, it gives you an idea of what things were like in Chrysostom's town, because he says you can go out on any Saturday night and see someone being stabbed. It's a pretty remarkable thing to say. But he says you don't see the wholeness of the crime. What you see is the outward and visible stabbing of the body of another person. But in that very moment, the person holding the knife has plunged a far sharper and more deadly knife into their soul, into the permanent part of who they are. And physicians may recover the wound that they inflicted bodily on the other person. But the only physician, Christ, is the one who can possibly recover the wound that their action has just inflicted on themselves. So that's one sense in which we're kind of wounded by what we do. And you have compassion on a wounded person. You don't have a go at them. You try and sort the thing out. And the other place where that comes from for me is Mother Julian. So you may remember in the Revelations of Divine Love, she tells that parable about the servant who wants to serve his master and who goes out and falls into a pit and is wounded by all these spikes. But how in the end, when he comes out and is transfigured, every one of those wounds becomes a jewel. And I think that is true. I mean, it's true, obviously, she's partly thinking about the wounds of Christ still there, in glorified, but still there. But actually, I think this is Paul's teaching about sin, that the very wounds we made in our own souls when we oppressed others, given back to God, searched, will actually become points of glory and sensitivity because we've gone into that. Do you see what I mean? The very failure to be sensitive to someone when it's revisited insensitivity increases one's power of empathy. And I think the language of woundedness also helps in the sense that we all know, just in terms of ordinary psychology, that people who do terrible things to other people have often had terrible things done to them, and we see the kind of horror of the Second World War partly arising out of the kind of retributive reparations at the end of the First World War. And until we recognize in the midst of our disputes our mutual woundedness, we're not going to be able to start getting healed.
Yeah, no, that's lots of hands. So Andrew and then Rode, please.
So I wanted.
Wait for the mic, Andrew.
You have to wait for the mic so people online can hear you.
And I think people online are going to be able to send some questions in as well, and Kathy will.
I'd love for you to say, thank you, a little bit more about the Christmas and Epiphany and the poem that you talked about when we met in the spring, the Gwyneth Lewis poem, the No Madonnas.
Oh, yeah.
And then also, I don't know if you were aware, another female influence on your poems, Peggy Parker is here, who did the sculpture of Mary Elizabeth and the Black Madonnas.
Thank you so much. I was really, it was that Black Madonna, which, thank you, Peggy. this poem wouldn't be the poem it is if it weren't for your sculpture, so I really appreciate that. The No Madonnas is a very interesting poem by Gwyneth Lewis. So it's a lovely idea in which he imagines, as it were, a series of potential Madonnas who said, I don't fancy it really, it's kind of, you know. And it's partly a beautiful exploration on the idea that God forces himself on no one. And that, you know, you remember in the reading we had in chapel just the other day, after he's been through literally hell and high water, he's been through the storm and the bloke called Legion, and then he finally goes up to the village and says, and they say, well, not today, thank you. And he immediately gets back in the boat. He never imposes himself. So Gwyneth's poem imagines a series of Madonnas who said no, and who turned back to their ordinary day. And I think it was a way of thinking about the enormity of Mary's yes, and the absolute freedom, the unconditional freedom of Mary to say yes or no. But the other thing that happened in that poem is for me to realize that in a sense, there are many Madonnas. You know, in a sense, every one of us becomes that when we are able to say yes to God.
Thank you. Dr. Muller, please.
Thank you so much for the presentation. My question is about, I want to ask you about who is speaking. Like you shared mostly about, you know, the imperial power, the oppressed people. So you think that you are speaking for both?
Yeah.
Or like, where is the place that you are speaking now?
Yeah.
And I have the next question I have is about the journey into one another's pain. So there is a pain. So whose pain? Like you think that, the pain for the oppressed or the colonized is equal with the pain of the oppressor or the colonized.
Yeah.
So whose pain is here? So who is walking in whose pain?
Yeah.
So I
Thank you. I mean, those are both very good questions. And when I first was asked to do this, I was hesitant for precisely the reason, you know, here am I, I'm a sort of, if you like, the kind of classic privileged white male, what have I got to say about this? And it was only because I saw that you had already been listening to the voices that could speak with authority and experience among you, that was there, that I felt I could, as it were, come as a stranger in your midst and begin to try and get a sense of where all that was going. But I recognize that we all speak from a particular place, though I do think every one of us does have a gift of empathy. We don't always use it, but I think we can, to some degree, journey into one another's pain. Now, on that phrase, the journey into one another's pain, which is Christ's journey into us, there are two things to say about that one. It's a journey, it's not finished. I don't think that we are there yet. And I'm certainly not making an equivalence between the pain of the oppressed and the oppressor, but I am saying that the oppressor must also be changed and healed and is diminished. I mean, is diminished by what they've done. So one of the lines of poetry that struck me very strongly when I was quite a young man, I was reading, as it were, the radical Shelley, reading the poems that, you know, the early poems that nobody read. There's an extraordinary long poem called Queen Mab. And Shelley, of course, eventually married or was partner with Mary Wollstonecraft's daughter. But this line early on, this is the line. It's about the gender inequalities. It's written in, 1816 or so, 70. And the line is, can man be free if woman is a slave? Now, what I learned from that line as a young man was about the mutuality, the entanglement, the fact that the person who is doing the oppression is, their suffering is not, of course not, but there is a diminishment in their being and their humanity, which also needs to be, and that in the redressing, in the re-establishment of a better relationship, there is obviously relief to the oppressed and freedom to the enslaved, but there is also, or should be, a change for the better, a kind of recovery inside the person. And that's no more than to say all of our lives are mutually enfolded, and most of the evil that we do consists in forgetting that, in othering the other. and thinking that what we do to them makes no difference to us. And that's what leads us into those kind of callous sins. The more we're aware of, to borrow a phrase that Charles Williams loved to use, of our co-inherence in one another, the more likely we are to redress some of the wrongs, or to begin to redress some of the wrongs. But I'm not suggesting that they're equivalent, the two pains into which we're journeying.
Thank you. I'm keeping an eye on Kathy, see if there are any questions online. Yes, Peggy, please. Okay. Wait for the mic to arrive. Peggy Parker.
Thank you for the poems and this very rich discussion, and your kind words about the sculpture and the painting. I thought immediately when you wrote about the searching of the wounds of Caravaggio's painting of Christ literally leading Thomas's hand into the wound, and so many paintings. They're very delicate, you know, and Thomas's hand is nowhere near the wounds, but Christ is actually putting Thomas's hand in those wounds, and that's such a powerful visual image of exploring wounds, and so that's what was your words evoked for me.
Yeah, so. And there's some wisdom in Thomas's saying, "I won't believe this until I know about the wounds." You know, I mean, there's a gospel song, isn't there? I think I heard Gillian Welch sing it, which goes, "I will know my Saviour when I come to him by the marks where the nails have been." Mm-hmm. And that, as it were, is the touch and the surety of the touch of who our Saviour is, that his wounds touch ours. One of the most helpful things I read in theological college myself, when I was at Ridley, was Dietrich Bonhoeffer's little book, Pastoral Care. And there's a passage in that where he talks about the real danger for clergy of being put on a pedestal and turned into some kind of magician who'll fix everything and made a bit of a cult of. And he says, you must never let that happen to you. You know, if you don't step off the pedestal immediately yourself, God will knock you off it in a horrible way. But, so what should you do instead? And he describes the task of the pastor as to take the wounded hand of the person who has come to him, put it into the wounded hand of Jesus, and get out of the way and let that transaction happen. Yeah, and that again, I think, goes back to the Thomas story.
Thank you. Two hands over there. I see Hannah, I see David. And Jennifer, if you give the mic to David, and we'll have 1 and 2. Yeah, Hannah, please.
So I couldn't resist because just coming off a class this past week, we were talking about Ephraim the Syrian and the role of poetry in doing hard theological work. And so in your conversation about Lancelot Andrewes, I was going to ask maybe a little bit, maybe more than you want to say, but what you feel how theology, how poetry informs what you think about divine accommodation, and how to understand. How to wonder, and how you approach using language, and how that sort of informs how you feel that God communicates with us.
Wow, that's a big question. Divine accommodation. I think what I want to say is this. One of the things that was really helpful to me when I was first trying to bring these, as I thought, distinct worlds of my literary life and my theological life, because I came up to Cambridge in the late 70s and read English, and I went off and was a school teacher, and then I had this vocation to priesthood, so I came back and did theology sort of 10 years later. But they were in that sense in separate things, and my book Faith, Hope and Poetry was a chance to try and bring them together. And the point where it suddenly took fire for me was when I was contemplating Shakespeare's account of poetry in A Midsummer Night's Dream, which I had always understood in purely literary terms as being about how poetry works. You remember it's the famous passage where he says, the poet's eye in fine frenzy rolling doth glance from heaven to earth, from earth to heaven. And as imagination bodies forth the form of things unknown, the poet's pen turns them to shapes and gives to airy nothing a local habitation and a name. So that juxtaposition of imagination and bodies, that finding form, body, taking the thing that was abstract and inarticulate and making it really live and move and breathe, and that's what poetry does. And I thought, well, that's fine, I understand that now. But when I was revisiting that passage, as it were, and still trying to think theologically and think about Christ, I suddenly thought, oh my goodness. Heaven, earth, heaven, body, where have I heard this before? And I suddenly realized that Shakespeare was just gently riffing on the prologue to John's Gospel. Because you can begin John's Gospel, you know, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and the same within was in with God, and all you're going around and you think, I'm sure this is really profound Greek philosophy, but I can't get hold of it, you know. And you're kind of bewildered by this, you know, stratospheric theological discourse, thinking, well, it's not for me. And then suddenly verse 14 comes along and it says, and the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us. And we saw it, we beheld his glory, glory as of the only begotten. We saw it in flesh and blood. And I suddenly realized that actually, and of course the word for made in John, without him wasn't anything made, it's poiesis. It's where we get the word poet from. And we see God taking this huge risk of utter embodiment. But we see it now, I saw it in the light, as a gloriously creative act, as a kind of powerful piece of kind of bodying and compression and making something available that wouldn't have been available otherwise, which is exactly what you're trying to do in poetry. So to go back to your question about God's accommodation and language, I think we're bold to make metaphor, to create shape, to give a local habitation and a name to otherwise abstract theology. We're bold to do that because God's already done it. Now, the danger for purely theological discourse outside of the arts, which is well, it's what Edwin Muir said when he was writing in his poem, The Incarnate One. He was writing about his experience of really bad church. And he says, the Word made flesh is here made words again. The Word made word in flourish and arrogant crook. See there? King Calvin with his iron pen. And God? 3 angry letters in a book. For here the mystery is impaled and bent into an ideological argument. So this is the danger of abstract, is there's a constant discarnating. What we're about is incarnating, and you'll see actually, you know, that incarnation, I'm so glad, is one of the consistent themes throughout this set of sonnets. I took care that was there, that it starts with this advent into the world, that it specifically makes Mary the type, and that in every one I'm trying to say God is incarnate, and he's incarnate in the flesh of Christ, but he's also incarnate in the flesh of your neighbor, and he's incarnate in the language of your neighbor, and so on. So that bodying forth, I think, is essential both to poetry and to theology.
Thank you. David, please.
Thank you. What a gift that you've given us. I'm married to a poet, and she's introducing poetry to my preaching. So the thing I wanted to ask you is about your process. You've gone through the church year. You've talked about the church seasons. I wonder, do you write one and then leave it and never go back to it? Or are you a tinkerer?
Right. Well, that's a very good question. I think the original composition and then the revision are 2 completely distinct processes. You have to kind of go with the flow when you're writing to some degree. And then, I mean, you can't really write a poem unless you're kind of passionately in love with it while you're writing it. You're loving it into being. And that means you ignore its flaws and foibles because it's just this beautiful thing you want to make. Now you have to kind of leave it there, then you have to go away and you have to come back and then say, okay, what have I got? How is this going to read to somebody else who doesn't have the inside knowledge of what now I can do some shaping and some revising. But if you bring your revision mode of mind, your critical discourse, your sense of analysis into play, whilst you're writing, then you just stop the process. It's just, it's stillborn. So I think they're two different processes. I mean, different poets differ on how long you should leave the poem before you revise it. I mean, I think it's Horace says you should put it in a drawer for 9 years. I haven't got the patience. But yeah, I mean, I will leave it, I'll certainly leave it for a week and then, come back. And I mean, and this was quite, as it happens, these particular poems as a sequence, although I wanted them to read and flow together, and you see I've made linking lines and images from one poem to another as a sequence. They nevertheless had, for me, a comparatively long gestation, because I began them when I was with you in the spring, so it was February or March, and I finished them in September, just in time. So, that was a longer thing. But it's partly what you were raising is that I felt, who am I to do this? I'm intruding. I'm not. I haven't grown up with your story, and I haven't grown up with the particular divisions in America and all these things. Although I understand them, and we're trying to. But I only understand them from outside. I don't understand them from inside. So I have to make a virtue of necessity and say, this is how your story looks to me. These are the kind of images I think I might be able to offer you to think about your own story. But in the end, it's your story and not mine. And all I'm doing is, as it were, offering a set of images and phrases which might enable your conversation and your narrative. I mean, I hope they have a fluency and coherence themselves, and I love pattern and form and order, and I want the thing to be made and shaped and as beautiful as I can make it and as musical as I can make it. But in the end, it has to be how you read it, how you own it, how you respond to it, your own inner story that makes it yours. I mean, it's yours now. I've given it to you. That's what I came to do. There you are. There it is. But what you make of it is up to you.
Yeah. Right at the back.
I'm sorry. My apologies. I just got here and I've been listening, and I just wanted to ask this question. It may have already been asked. What part of spirituality plays into your poetry writing? Does spirituality play into your poetry writing? And if so, how do you allow that in?
Oh, wow. Okay, well, the short answer is yes, they come together. And I think my vocation as a poet became more of a whole thing. For a long time, I used to be afraid, when I was ordained and I had huge amounts of work to do, that if I spent some time in the hut writing poetry, that I was sort of robbing Peter to pay Paul in some way, that there was some sort of conflict between those. And I had to learn really from George Herbert. No, that's not. Now, certainly, when I'm writing poetry like this, there is prayer involved, there is openness to God, there is waiting. I slightly hesitate with the word spirituality, which is comparatively recent coinage, because I'm so wary of the discarnate, because I'm so wary of language about spirit, which takes us away from our real, actual sweating bodies where we are. I hesitate spirituality, but I think I can answer the question best, if I may, with a poem. I wrote a poem which was intended to be a poem about what I needed to do in order to write poetry. It was sort of a set of admonitions and instructions from the muse. But as I wrote it, I realized it was also about prayer. And if it's about spirituality, it's about a particularly embodied spirituality. Let me see if I can remember it. It's called The Singing Bowl. And it begins like this. Begin the song exactly where you are. Remain within the world of which you're made. Call nothing common in the earth or air. Accept it all and let it be for good. Start with the very breath you breathe in now, this moment's pulse, this rhythm in your blood, and listen to it, ringing soft and low. Stay with the music, words will come in time. Slow down your breathing. Keep it deep and slow. Become an open singing bowl whose chime is richness rising out of emptiness and timelessness resounding into time. And when the heart is full of quietness, begin the song exactly where you are. Now, I sometimes recite that to myself before I start writing another poem, just to remind myself what it is I think I'm doing.
Thank you. Dr. Moller wants to come back, and Dr. Knowles. Sheila, Jennifer.
How are we doing?
Dr. Moller. Where are you going, Sheila? Oh, okay. Right, we'll go 1, 2, 3. I didn't see you there, Stuart, to be honest. So, Jennifer, do you want to do Rode, please? And then Dr. Knowles? I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I was feeling torn as you're beginning, thinking that great art needs no explanation. Mm-hmm. You know, that to be put in a spot where you have to somehow interpret your work to us is a cruel thing to ask. On the other hand, I think it's also a gift for people who are in a position to communicate to other people, to hear and see how it is that you communicate, how it is that you put things together in order to have layers of meaning for others to draw from. That it's not as simple as words on a page. Yeah. And that it is in the breathing of the word, of living it, that it becomes real in our lives and available to us.
Yeah, and as I said when I began a little bit of drawing out, I put a big caveat to say the poet may not know at all really what's happening for you in your poem as I've given it to you. You need to kind of open that out and draw it. But I just thought I thought you got me here for an hour and a half. I'm going to have to say something. It's kind of, you know. But obviously I wanted to draw attention to certain things as they struck me at the time of composition. But in a sense, we won't know for a while what you've got until you've kind of stayed with it and, you know, see if it lasts at all.
So I want to also affirm that you sound a little hesitant saying Trinity and beyond.
Yeah.
That when Trinity Sunday rolls around, I expect to find a four-leaf clover.
Yeah.
Because I believe that Trinity is only a glimpse of what there is to know. Yeah. That there's the fourth leaf is everything of God that we haven't met yet, that we don't have names for. Yeah. And so Trinity and beyond, for this whole 5 poems can't sum up exactly what the task was, and that it's beyond the poems as well, that it leads us on to the 6th poem and the 7th and continuing the story, that it is not done.
Well, those will be for you to write. I mean, when I was thinking of Trinity and Beyond, I was not only thinking of the ineffability of God, but also of the good old-fashioned season of Trinity. I don't know if we're allowed to have it anymore, but I always used to like that sort of 16th Sunday after Trinity, because I thought, give me some time to think about this. So, so thank you.
But there's always more.
Yeah, thank you very much, Bruce. There was one question from Rode, so we'll do Rode and then we'll do Melody. Can you get to Rode, please? Sheila? Thank you very much. And these will be the last 2 questions because the time has arrived.
Thank you again. So my question is on Christmas Epiphany. So you talked about the black and white Christ.
Or Black and White Madonna.
Yeah, Madonna. So you were. So I wonder if you were thinking about hybridity there, like because in the post-colonial context, we always think that's the only way that can bring us together, like the black and white together, like the hybrid identity.
I wasn't actually so much thinking about hybrid identity. I think I have some issue with hybridity, and I think people should be glad of their distinctiveness as well as what they have in common. Mm-hmm. I was literally. I mean, the Black Madonna as a phrase was obviously partly because one thinks of, there is a famous icon called the Black Madonna, but they were, and I simply want to say what my idea, I mean, the important word there was and rather than as. It's not black as white, or it's simply, it's both and, that there is, you know, we imagine, I mean, you think of all the European art that is imagined, not only a white Madonna, but an entirely European white Madonna looking, like a sort of, somebody. Whereas, obviously Miriam wouldn't have looked like that. There's been a whole Gentilizing of the Jewishness of Mary and Christ. But if there was a freedom in that, it actually brought it home to people. It was, the Madonna like the people in your street. Then that same freedom is there, obviously, in a black community or a Native American community or anything, that there is a proper incarnation into color and culture. But the word is and, that the heart of what I was saying is we can't do without each other. We do actually need each other, and it's precisely the differences between each other that we need, that we make up in and for each other what is not complete. That's why the opening, in a sense, the whole poem needs to be read, the whole poem taken as a single sequence, needs to be read in light of the opening phrase, which is, only together, never set apart. Only together, never set apart. And obviously I was aware of the Jim Crow laws and all of that. There was that sort of, and I witnessed apartheid, South Africa. And my family were exiled from when Smith took over Rhodesia and declared UDI, thus forming an illegal government in order to make Rhodesia more hideously like South Africa, because ironically the colonial laws were actually at least moderating some of the excesses. When that happened, my parents regarded the government as illegal. They arrested the Governor General, and my parents went to visit him, as a result of which, because we were saying we can't have this separation, and there was a law passed that you couldn't have an African in your house, my father was eventually arrested, and we were expelled from the country. So it was kind of patterned into me. We became refugees in 1967, and it was patterned into me that was because my father utterly understood that we work and grow together and never set apart. And it was the set apartness that he was resisting, in the Rhodesia of the 60s. And so that was just absolutely been in me. So in a sense, I felt your story, as far as I'm able to understand it as a stranger, has been precisely to try and begin, I'm not saying by any means the process is over, to redress the false set apartness and to bring an and togetherness into rather than an either or.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you very much. And finally.
Thank you. I have a hunch my question will take you back to the first line again. I'm actually with Father Bruce. It seems a little bit unfair to interrogate the poet when we read the
Yes.
poems, but we so rarely get to do it, so it really is a delight. You said that you love pattern and that you love pattern, and your poems are all, what are they, 14 lines?
The 14 lines,
10
the
beats?
iambic pentameter,
Yeah.
the 5 stresses.
Yeah, okay.
I varied the rhyme schemes quite a bit. I didn't,
Yeah.
stick to just the Shakespeare. I do
Okay.
various things, and I leave the occasional orphan line, but yeah.
Okay, so yeah, they're these kind of blocks, except in your third poem where there's a space.
Yeah, so
that's all,
that's
so what's about
the
the
space. Let me explain the space. Yeah, so this is to do with the sonnet. There are, broadly speaking, there's the Italian sonnets form, the Petrarchan ones, and there's the Shakespearean ones. The Shakespearean one has divides the 14 up into 3 4s and a 2. The Italian one divides it up into an 8 and a 6, an octet and a sestet, and I avail myself of both. But the Italians have this wonderful phrase, the volta. So that space represents the volta, the turn, a new angle. So my octet in the Pentecost sonnet is about the new identity in Christ. But lest that be mistaken for some ideal of the monocultural or the monoglot, the volta turns around and goes, yeah, but it's tongues of fire, and it's noticing the distinctness of the neighbor, and it's needing the neighbor. It's the plurality and diversity is what happens. So that's marked by the space. In fact, a lot of the sonnets have less formal voltas. Generally, a lot of the way, the sonnet is a wonderful form because it concentrates the mind, because you've got to end, that 14th line is coming, and and often when you're writing a sonnet, you get a good line, you think, oh good, I've got a poem, and you start to write from it, and it just runs into the sand. And then you realize that the great line you got to begin with is the last line. And that you have to find out why it was a good line by writing towards it. But whichever way, you've only got the 14. So Shakespeare plays with this wonderfully. I mean, part of the idea of the volta, or the idea, Shakespeare often, since he has 3 4s and a 2, he often goes like thesis, 4 lines, antithesis, contradiction, 4 lines, some kind of synthesis, 4 lines, handy summary, couplet, So much so that some people find them, they refer to Shakespeare as having redundant couplet syndrome, because he's already said it. But Shakespeare knows perfectly well that people are thinking like that, so he often teases you. And there's a wonderful sonnet, I think it's the one when in disgrace with fortune in men's eyes, I will alone beweep my outcast state, troubled deaf. So he gets 4 lines of this is terrible. And you go, okay, fine, it's a love poem. You're going to say it's going to... But then you get another 4 lines with no change at all. It's just like it's even worse than I said it was before. And then you get another 4 lines where everything is completely disastrous. And you're thinking, Shakespeare, you've only got 2 lines left. How are you going to do this? That's part of the fun of it. And then he ends the sonnet. But if the while I think on thee, dear friend, all losses are restored and sorrows end. And he ends the poem with end, and it's beautiful. But you wouldn't have the joy and the fun of seeing him do that if you and he hadn't agreed to this game that you play together, whereby he says, okay, we're agreed, I've only got 14 lines. It's like playing football with actually an offside rule and, boundaries. That's what makes it a good game.
And on that note, thank you very much indeed. So friends, before you flee off, we gather again at 5:15 for Convocation Evensong. You now have a window of opportunity to enjoy each other and conversation. Do please to the newly renovated spaces, including the library, where alum Marlene Norton is there to offer tours. Thank you once again. Thank you, Malcolm.
Thank you.
We're going to have a quick picture, I'm afraid.
Okay, right.
This is the.
Yeah, okay.
Should we use?